Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. I have a really great story behind the book today. I am so happy to welcome today somebody who has been on our radio program and twice with Bria Bird. Hi there, Danielle. How are you?
I'm doing great, Patsy. How are you doing?
Okay, I wanted to show that picture there of Bria Burton because she's had the pleasure of talking to you twice on the radio, and she does these book buzzes for you to promote your books, which we
Yeah.
play. We do these book buzzes, and we play them sometimes years after the book has come out because authors need that kind of promotion.
It's true. Yeah, we do. We rely on fans and people who are interested in books paying attention when we have something worth reading. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's what we like to do here. And then this book is a very special book, The God of Story. And people sometimes don't realize that there have been many novelists who have been deeply involved with religion in various ways, different religions, and it's been an important part of their lives. And they've written books about religion, and one of my favorite is Dorothy Sayers. For me, her mysteries are the top. Most people don't realize that she was very religious, and she gave up writing the Peter Wimsey novels to concentrate on books that would promote religion because it was at the time of World War II when things were looking pretty desperate in the world.
Yeah, Dorothy Sayers is a brilliant author who's, in my opinion, underappreciated nowadays. She's remembered for the Peter Wimsey books, as you said, but she also did some other incredible work. She has a great book called The Mind of the Maker, and she did some translations of Dante. I think she got his first two books done before she died. They're still considered perhaps the best English translations of from the original. Yeah, she's great.
And her books about religion are deeply moving. Winston Churchill appreciated her books, the insights that she gave, and helped people with their faith during those troubled times. Now, here you've written The God of Story, which it's funny when you think about it. We're talking about stories from the Bible, and that's the greatest book ever written. So you got a lot to work with.
Yeah, it's true. Now, this book was written in part because I've been fascinated with story my whole life. But my idea for this book was really that there's a kind of underlying human language that transcends cultures and time. And that language is the language of story, which I think it differs a little bit from culture to culture, but the same patterns, same themes, same character types and archetypes and transformations hold through time and around the world. And I think that's significant in a philosophical way, but also in a religious way. I think it's something that points to, you might say, the God of story is about the God who gives story meaning. And as a book, it unpacks the five basic elements of every story, things like characterization and plot and context and theme. And it looks at those as techniques, and then it applies those to the Bible and says, in essence, what can we learn from the Bible that we might have been overlooking because we've been analyzing it through its linguistics rather than through the fourth language that it's written in. So it's not just Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, it's also story. The Bible is written in a language called story.
It is the greatest story ever told, and that's absolutely true. When you look at it from that point of view and think of it as an epic, we're
Mhm.
talking an epic. I think you're exactly right. You captured something here, the essence of the story, which is why it can be translated into so many languages and people relate to it in no matter what language they're reading it. So let's start at the beginning because I love the way you start the book. I love that you're telling a story to us as you're telling a story about telling a story, which which is we get a lot in there. I like the way you did it.
Yeah, thank you. It really grew out of my love of storytelling since I was a little kid. I wanted to be a writer. I've been pursuing that my whole life and writing science fiction and fantasy. I went to school for 8 years before going back and getting my doctorate. I spent 8 years of my life as a young man studying story at the university before I went back to get my doctorate in theology. I was studying creative writing, and one of the things that I noticed as a young man in graduate school was that the college was teaching me a lot of postmodern literature, a lot of postmodern stuff that was It was interesting in one way, but it wasn't very well developed from a story standpoint. And at the same time as I was finding my own path to faith as a Christian, I was starting to get into reading the Bible, and I was noticing, why is it when I'm in a church setting or going to a Bible study or a young men's meeting or something, when we talk about the Bible, we have these great stories, but we tell them in the most lifeless and boring way possible, as if they're not actually stories. And then in my studies at the university at a state school, I was learning about story or about literature, but we were studying the most meaningless, empty stories possible. And so I went on this kind of personal quest for years to figure out, what is it that makes stories work? Because I thought that I would learn it in college, and I didn't. I had a couple of really good professors who pointed me maybe in the direction of pursuing story, but I wasn't really given the keys to it. So I've spent my adult life studying what makes stories work as stories. And it took me a while to get the confidence, even going back to school and studying theology, to see that maybe something is wrong with the way. It's not that our theology is wrong, it's that we've been focusing so much on the languages, on the Greek and the Aramaic and the Hebrew, that we've missed the bigger story patterns. So it's not a knock on any particular approach, but I think most of the time theologians haven't studied story patterns, and so they've overlooked things. They've been looking for doctrines, they haven't been looking for other layers of meaning in the story. And when I started realizing that the same principles that apply to Shakespeare can be just turned around and used in the Bible, not just in a book by book basis, but over the whole arc of the story, it really brought an incredible amount of meaning and insight, I think, to the way I read the Bible. And I'm not claiming something new. I actually think that I'm pointing at things that people knew a long time ago and we just forgot because of our Enlightenment rationalism. We started reading it looking for propositions instead of looking at it for story markers. And that was you might say, our undoing to seeing the bigger story.
All of Western literature is basically has been influenced by the patterns that originated in the Bible. They,
Yeah.
without even understanding that they're using it, because they have read this, and particularly, I'm sure Shakespeare read the Bible many times over.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it would be just natural for somebody like him, who is aware more of story, that he was getting it. I think he was getting it.
I do too. I do
he, he
too. Yeah.
he got that pattern, and
Yeah.
most people haven't looked at it from that point of view. And I think that really is helpful. Isn't it amazing that this book, you can pick it up, you haven't read it, maybe you haven't read it for years, and then you pick it up and you say, whoa, why?
Yeah. Yeah, and there are so many things in the Old Testament and New Testament that take on new layers of meaning. And there's historically there are approaches to this that we know the rabbis would teach a four-layer process that began with the literal and then moved to the typological and then the metaphorical and then the revelational. And you don't have to even think in those patterns to recognize that when you read one of Jesus's parables, you can see something in it when you're 19 that you have no ability to see until you're like 40 or something. And then I'm almost 60, and I see things in the parables I've read for years that it never occurred to me. And it's just, when did that get there? I knew this story, and how did this all of a sudden it means something new to me?
It is really amazing. And when you're in services and you're reading, or the reading parts of it, you might not get the whole thing, but then sometimes you start reading it as a story and it really captures you.
Yes.
How many times you've read it, how many times you know the story.
Right.
That's the beauty of this. So let's start at the beginning, the way you approached it. Let's talk about this pyramid that you start with in chapter 1.
There's basically been two approaches to teaching writing in a kind of simplistic sense. I teach Comp 1 and Comp 2 as well as other English classes. And we think of them as the right side up pyramid or the upside down pyramid. So there's deductive argument, and deductive storytelling is the sort of storytelling that hard news or journalists employ it's also the same thing that propagandists do. And basically it's just when you say some propositional truth at the beginning, and then you work out increasing bits of evidence for it, you get more and more specific. So hard news stories will start out with a kind of who, what, when, where, why, and how in the first paragraph. And then you can quit reading after that if you just want the basis of the story. But if you keep reading, you'll find quotes from other people, and then the senator said this and his assistant said that. And that's deductive, and it's really useful because you can structure your support for it based on something you want to prove. So it's actually one of the most common method that preachers use too in sermons is they'll want to prove a point, 3 reasons why you should be grateful for your mother on Mother's Day or something, and they'll find 3 reasons. Nothing wrong with that, but that's the default way that we teach storytelling in a basic way because it's easy to learn and it's very formulaic. The problem with it is that it allows you to choose the evidence to fit the thing you want to prove and disregard evidence that doesn't support what you want to prove. So you can pick the Bible verses you want for your sermon, you might say. There's another kind of writing that's the inductive method, and that is where you begin with something specific and you move towards a more general concluding principle. In Aesop's fable, where you have the fox and the grapes, and you start out getting this story, and at the very end, you get the moral of the tale, which is with Aesop, it was probably added later, but Aesop's a really good picture of this, right? You get the story, and then the story gets its little lesson at the end, and that's the inductive method. But that's not the way life works. Life doesn't come to us packaged deductively or inductively. It actually comes to us in something that Charles Saunders Peirce called the abductive, which doesn't mean to be captured by space aliens. It means that you get specifics that you have to interpret without any other outside interpretation. And this is the way most great novels and great films, Jesus's long form parables, most of the Bible in its narrative is not interpreting itself for you in some kind of clear, it does use clear propositions sometimes, but most of the time it's leaving the interpretation to your careful thought and meditation and prayer. And this is the same way life works. Charles Saunders Peirce said, you look out a window and you see the grass and the street and the driveway are wet, and you don't assume that a fire truck came by and hosed everything down, though that's one possible explanation. It's not a very likely one. The likely explanation is that it rained. And that's the way we interpret life. The Bible is actually written this way. It requires that we lean into it, but we have been interpreting it as if it is more like a deductive or inductive story. And that means we've been looking for the propositional truths rather than letting it pull us and invite us into it. And I think this is, I don't know how deep your readers would want me to go, but Jesus said something like this when he said, whatever is hidden was meant to be disclosed, whatever was concealed was meant to be brought into the open. And that was his explanation for why he's speaking in parables. Disciples were super puzzled. Why are you speaking in parables all the time? He said, why do you put a lamp on a stand? The parable makes the light go farther. That's why. So the story makes the truth in the story go farther than if you just wag your finger, than if you just tell someone, here's the principle you need to get. Telling someone the principle they need to get will almost never result in them getting the principle. Telling them a story that they have to figure out has a better chance of communicating to them than telling them what they ought to believe.
So, in essence, Jesus was the first cozy mystery author putting
Yeah.
out those Easter eggs, right?
Yes, he was putting out Easter eggs, but Jesus was, he indicated that there was more. He had these catchphrases. He would say, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And he made it available, but he did not force people to come and arrive at the right conclusion. He just told the story and he let it out there. And then he only explained himself when the disciples came and demanded an explanation. And sometimes when they demanded an explanation, he explained it with another parable, which is, it shows you how committed to this process he really was.
That's what cozy mystery authors do. They keep throwing those Easter eggs in. You have to see if you're
Yeah,
smart enough to catch them. I can see people now running to their Bible today and they're going to pull it open. I have to figure this out. I have to figure this out.
yeah, that would be cool.
I think that's great. When we're thinking about it, and of course, the Bible is filled with characters and people all over the place. There's so many characters to deal with. how as how can a writer use what you've discovered and what you've gleaned from all of this research that you've been doing and studying that you've been doing over the years? How can they approach perhaps building characters, or what other things do you think they will be able to get from this book?
I think writers will find a particular interest in characters, the something that they probably already know, but don't know that they know the way they know it, which is that stories have to be simplified. So characters are never representations of real people. They are always representations of certain aspects of humanity. So sometimes writers, when they're, especially when they're beginning to write fiction, think they're trying to capture a whole character. You really can't do that. You don't have the space. People are too complex. So the way writers have done this since going back to Gilgamesh, the oldest literature that we have, and particularly in the Bible, they've tried to capture something dominant that's internal and something dominant that's external. So it's a kind of parallelism that I talk about in the book in several places. But basically, there's going to be a desire for a story goal. The character wants to destroy the ring of power in the fiery chasm of Mount Doom if you're reading Lord of the Rings, or they want to blow up the Death Star if they're in Star Wars. That's so they want something on the outside, but on the inside, there's some kind of flaw or quirk that has to be overcome. And that's part of the equation of the storytelling. That the kind of arrangement that the storyteller is making with the audience is the hero of the story, the protagonist of the story, will succeed if he or she overcomes the force of opposition, the Darth Vader or the Sauron or whoever the villain is in the story, and if they overcome their own flaw. And that flaw can be really simple. It doesn't even have to be something like the temptation to destroy the world. It can just be a temptation to lie or to make themselves look a little bit better than they are. It can even be the temptation to believe a lie that feels good. There are many stories that explore these things, but basically, the most profound characters that we are drawn to are the ones that have a kind of flaw that they're wrestling with and a goal they're trying to achieve by the end of the story. That's very simple, but you can create complex characters by jamming those two things together, by having something that they want that they're being opposed in pursuing, and having something they have to overcome. Frodo Baggins wants to destroy the Ring of Doom because he wants to save Middle Earth. The problem is that he's carrying the ring and he's falling in love with it. And so it's his own temptation to become the next Sauron is tugging at him. And Tolkien was able to sustain the entire Lord of the Rings written as one book. It's 700 and some thousand, 770,000 words, I believe. He sustained that story. He did a lot of things in that story with those words, but Frodo as the character who is on the quest, the primary character on the quest, is built around those two things: resisting the ring and destroying it, destroying it externally and resisting it internally. That's one example.
Yeah, and that's a good one because certainly in the Bible we have a lot of flawed characters.
We do.
So there was a lot to work with that, and that's another when you're talking about something epic. And wow, when you think of Lord of the Ring, it is a lot of words. People don't sometimes
Yeah.
the fact that people don't realize how many words is the testament to how good it is because you don't
Yeah.
care. You can't stop.
Yep.
So
This
that's
is absolutely brilliant work. Yeah. Yeah, I love Lord of the Rings. It's a great
oh
example of simple storytelling that is also not simple at the same time. Yeah.
exactly. It has great depth. In another chapter, you talk about themes. And what does that mean? How do you approach it from the point of view of what you've learned from studying the Bible? What, how do you, people are, oh, first of all, life for a writer these days is difficult enough. It's just so difficult with
Yeah.
everything that's going on. It's amazing that so many writers can concentrate on writing when there's so much else they're expected to do. It's not easy. Tolstoy had his wife to do everything. That was
Yeah.
it. He didn't have to go around doing social media and
Yeah.
all of this other nonsense that writers have to do today. And it's hard to switch brains, not even brains, maybe add some extra hard disk in there or something. uh, But
Yeah, the level of research, even researching takes time. If you're writing if you're writing historical, if you're writing even science fiction and fantasy, is going to require some research, some thought, and yeah, the amount of marketing and social media and other things that you're required to do today in this market is it's a lot. But yeah, and my approach to theme as I've gotten older and taught more and more students in writing, I think it's important to begin understanding that the theme of a book is what it's about. The plot is what happens in the book, but the theme is what the book is about. And people get those confused a little bit. You can know what's going to happen in your story, but not know what you're writing about until you're three-fourths of the way done. Sometimes I've written books where I thought I knew what I was writing about from the very beginning, and I had the theme, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to get there. In essence, studying theme, at least from the perspective of the God of story, I think comes down to understanding, again, the kind of parallelism that is that embraces opposites. So it's one of the things that implies reality and depth is the presence of things that are on opposing sides but are smashed together. This is where in my opinion, this is where we get archetypes. I've read other people's ideas about where they get archetypes. I'm not claiming everybody else is wrong if you're a Jungian psychologist or whatever, but I think archetypes are a function of story. And archetypes are constructed when you have a character who is both a thing and also not a thing, meaning you get the robot character who is mechanical but also human. You get the man-child character who is fully grown and should be mature, and that yet they act like a child, right? You get the noble peasant who is somehow a king but walking around as if they're a commoner. And there's just over and over again. If you look at the archetypes, if you look at what's really going on in them, they're showing us what it looks like to be a but also not a, and because that's what it means to be human. And it sounds almost too simple in some ways. If you're a writer listening to this, wait a minute, A and not A, like how do those exist? That's humanity. You have met people. You've met let's see, the bumbling authority who has all the he has all the authority in the world, but none of the responsibility. He blames everything on his subordinates. Even though he's the one calling the shots, he blames failure on them. And that is authority without responsibility. It's A and not A. It's the things that shouldn't be together, they go together. And you can do that with basically any archetype that exists, in my opinion. And that's why I think they're a function of story, showing us something about human nature. And that's essentially what theme is doing. It's exploring opposing sides of it's showing us. If I can give you a quick example, I didn't put this in the book, but it's the sort of thing that's in the book. There's a story in the Old Testament about King David. He's the most complex character in the Old Testament. There's more words written about him than other characters. He's also the most ambiguously drawn, which is interesting. But David has this terrible sin where he has one of his most faithful men, Uriah the Hittite, murdered because he slept with Uriah's wife while Uriah was off fighting in one of David's battles. And then Bathsheba gets pregnant, and David, to cover up his crime, has Uriah murdered. And lots of people know that story, how, David, the great man after God's own heart, the king and whose descendant would be the Messiah, that king did that terrible thing. And so he's rebuked by the prophet Nathan. And that in that scene, Nathan uses a story to convict David. And the theme of the story is what gets his heart. But here's what's interesting. Nathan actually confronts him a second time, and nobody ever talks about it. And what he tells him the second time is that when Bathsheba has another child, he comes to David and he says, "The Lord is telling you to name the child Jedediah." And David does not name the child Jedediah. He names the child Solomon. And that if you're an English speaker who has no connection to Hebrew, you won't understand the theme of what's going on. You have to understand what those words, those names mean. Solomon is basically a reference to peace. So he's calling his son the thing that he wanted his whole life. He was a king, a warfare guy. He killed lots of people, but he's trying to, I think, to put something better in his son, give him an identity grounded in peace. But the identity he was supposed to give him was Jedediah, which means loved by God. And if you look at the story of Solomon, Solomon goes from being the wisest, most prosperous, most peaceful king to being, under his leadership, he turns Israel into another Babylon. And he sacrifices all of the things that David did, essentially. He sacrifices them for peace. And that is thematic. It's not something that you can get to without using the language of story. You can't get to it if you're not looking at the whole arc of David and the whole arc of Solomon. So without that, the story becomes just things happening, not what those things happening means. And that's what theme is. It's the meaning of all the things that are happening in the story.
Moby Dick has a theme.
Yep.
To Kill a Mockingbird has a theme.
Yeah.
It's not just an event that happened in a southern town. It has a real strong theme,
Right.
and it's amazing. It's so powerful. It's powerful because it
Yeah.
has a theme.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
There have been dozens and dozens of books written about problems in the South between the races. They're forgotten. But
Right.
boy, that book will last forever.
Yeah, she told a story around it that embodied things rather than just explaining things. And that's really the power of the storyteller, is to show us something and force us to turn it over in our minds and analyze it and think about it without telling us what it means. The theme itself will be revealed in the thing we're looking at if it's well constructed, but it also will require us to look at it closely. And that's what that book does.
Yeah, it certainly does. There's another chapter that I like very much. It's called Behold. I don't know why I was going to say the honorable hippo because it's H. The wonderful hippo. Behold
Yes.
the wonderful hippo. Tell us about that. And what does that mean?
You can actually see I have a hippo. If you're seeing this at the Zoom call, there's a hippo behind me right here. It's something that's meaningful to me. That this is a chapter that unpacks the book of Job and why it's more deep and more relevant to all of the Bible and even all of, I think, human history than we've interpreted it to be. People think it's just about a good man's suffering. It seems so meaningless to him, but I think it's deeper than that. And the reference to the hippo is actually from the end of the story when Job, who's been complaining to God, meets with God, or rather, God meets with Job to answer his accusations. And God tells him to look at two creatures. He says, look at Behemoth and then Leviathan. And it's difficult to prove what these mean because nobody knows what the word behemoth means. It's related to ox. Most scholars say it's a hippo. I think it's a hippo, the way it's described. And the idea is in chapter 6, it's a very complex and long unpacking of the book of Job. But it's basically saying that the theme of Job and the theme of the Bible is that we have more allegiance to power than we do to principle. And that is what drives a lot of our stories today, is we will put a principled, powerful hero against an unprincipled, powerful villain. And then that's what drives most superhero movies. It drives probably 98 or 99% of the long form storytelling that's going on today as a power versus power story. But the arc of the Bible is actually something more like principle stripped of power versus power that has no principle. And those are two very different things that require a lot of thought. But in the book of Job, the accusation from Satan to God about Job is that Job is only a good guy because of the things you do for him. He's not a good guy. If you take away all the good things you've done for him, he will renounce you and curse you. And of course, that's not what happens when Job is tormented. Job actually remains loyal. And this is part of the profoundness of the thing, is that I would say the behemoth hippo character or creature is a kind of metaphor for God's ways. And the Leviathan thrashing sea monster is a metaphor for the ways of Satan. So you have good and evil embedded in the end of the story, all through the story. But goodness itself is actually hidden. It has its own kind of power, but it's not the sort of power that we want generally. It's a peaceful kind of power. It's there. It doesn't seem to be there even when it's there. Whereas the power of the side that doesn't have principles, that power can, it's almost irresistible from a power standpoint. So I know this gets theoretical without, I can't really unpack the whole chapter here because it's fairly long. But yeah, the point of it is that the best stories that are the most revelatory tend not to pit power versus power, but to pit principle versus power and show us how love, stripped of its strong right arm, stripped of its Marine Corps rescue helicopters or sheriff's deputies riding in to say, when it doesn't have any of that stuff, when it's just love alone or truth alone or courage alone, that actually has a way of transforming the world, even when it's powerless.
I always like when people have clever clever chapter headings. This is something people often don't think about, that when you have chapter headings and people at the list in the front and they see a nice chapter, right away they start thinking, oh, this guy knows what he's doing. This gal has a clever turn of phrase. And I like it. I think it adds depth. A simple thing as a good title for a chapter, I think, is important. Tell us about the Wabbit.
Kill the Wabbit. The chapter on Kill the Wabbit is actually about the internal and external nature of characters. So I think you can use What's Opera Doc, which is a Bugs Bunny short from whenever they came out. Warner Brothers produced this. I loved Bugs Bunny Roadrunner cartoons as a kid. If you've ever seen What's Opera Doc, it's a take on Wagner's Ring opera. And in it, Bugs Bunny is dressed up as Brunhilde. So he's this Viking princess or whatever, and Elmer Fudd falls in love with him. Elmer Fudd's got the spear magic helmet, right? The horned Viking helmet. And so it's all set to music. It's literally, it's very absurd. And then in the about halfway through, when Bugs Bunny's fake hair and helmet fall off and Elmer Fudd realizes that it's actually Bugs Bunny, whom he hates, he goes from loving Brunhilde to wanting to kill the Wabbit, right? So that's what his kind of catch line through all the cartoons: kill the Wabbit. And so he pursues him and he zaps him with lightning from his spear and magic helmet. And the point of that is that in order for Elmer Fudd to get the story goal, which was Brunhilde, he has to overcome the force of opposition and his own nature, and he can't overcome his own nature. So it seems like this is just a cartoon, right? Yeah, but it's actually using really profound storytelling techniques. And that's why it's a tragedy as a story. The original, like, you compress it into this little cartoon with Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny, and it actually is a cartoon that ends on tragedy. Bugs Bunny gets killed in the end of What's Opera Doc. And when Elmer Fudd sees what he's done, he actually sings, "What have I done? I've killed the Wabbit. Poor little Wabbit, poor little bunny." And picks up Bugs Bunny's dead body. And at the end, Bugs Bunny says, "What did you expect in an opera? A happy ending?" It's very funny, but it's at the same time, it's showing you how this principle of parallelism works in stories.
It's one of the best cartoons ever. It is really great. The music, everything, the way they did it, and I love Elmer Fudd. There's so much to think about. What are some of the technical ideas that you can give here to authors?
The thing I haven't mentioned is voice, and I don't need to say a lot about voice. I think my approach to voice in the story is to explore it as a tool for understanding scripture. But voice is basically personality in print. I don't think that you can invent a narrative voice. It's impossible to invent an authorial voice. You have to be yourself. You have to be authentic to be authorial. And it's something that develops naturally the more you write and the more you try to be honest and tell the truth. So I think it is a mistake to write purely for an audience. That doesn't mean you shouldn't know the genre, the expectations of the genre, which group you're writing for. You don't want to push people away deliberately. But I think if the gift that writers have to offer any culture is telling the truth. Telling the truth is harder than it sounds because most of the time we don't want to hear the truth. So it takes a lot of skill to tell the truth in such a way that people pay attention and this is again going back to the thing I mentioned at the beginning when Jesus spoke in parables, it was in part to bypass our walls that we put up to having to change, to looking at things we don't want to look at, or think about things we don't want to think about. And when you tell it in a story, when you tell it in a parable, when you tell it in a cozy mystery, if you are telling the truth about the way humans are, and you are exploring themes that matter, that communicate meaning, I think your voice will emerge through that. And I think you'll be doing the job that you've been asked to do as a person, as a writer born to write, or whatever's drawing you to write. That instinct is probably more than just wanting to say something. It's probably because you have something to say.